Welcome back, everyone, to part 4 of our look at the series Japanese Militarism by Extra History. As always, highly encourage you to support the original content creator. They do this incredible work so that we can continue the conversation and dive a little deeper into these topics and look at ways in which they connect or parallel other parts of history. If you want to see the first 3 episodes of my reaction to this series, the link is in the description to go back to the beginning. The link is also there to the original content creator. And I also want to give a shout out to Andrea, who had created our original overlay that you see here for vlogging through history, and has sent me an updated one, which I think looks fantastic. I don't really use Twitter, so we've removed Twitter from that, and it's a better quality one. So thank you, Andrea, for that. But let's go ahead and dive into part 4 of Japanese militarism.
Manchuria, September 19th, 1931, 11:48 a.m. Tat-tat, rat-tat-tat. The sake is good. The hotel is comfortable. The geisha is dancing. General Tatekawa is enjoying himself. Who knew this last-minute assignment to Manchuria would be so relaxing? Tat-tat, rat-tat-tat, tat-tat, rat-tat-tat. Yesterday, his bosses in the army ministry had found out something was afoot in Manchuria. A plot by insubordinate members of the Kwantung Army to start a war with China. So Tatekawa had been rushed from Tokyo to Kwantung Army headquarters in order to quash it. But when he got there, he told the leaders that his message from Tokyo could wait until tomorrow. After all, Tatekawa himself thought a war with China might not be so bad. Hey,
this is what's dangerous about having such power vested in the military, is that what do we have here? We've got some low-level officers and soldiers who have done something that could potentially start a war. Now the first opportunity up the chain of command to squash this and to take it back the other direction is actually going to escalate it even further. And by the time it's going to get to the civilian authorities in Tokyo, they're really just not going to be able to do much about it.
Hey, could anyone recommend a good hotel? So he passed out drinking last night and carried on partying this morning. The geisha dances, the shamisen plays. The music nearly covers the sound of gunfire. The sound he's pretending he can't hear. Ta-ta, rat-ta-ta-ta-ta, ta-ta-ta.
Wow.
This episode of Extra History is brought to you by all of our wonderful patrons over on Patreon. Thanks so much for your support. Japan's civilian government didn't take the Kwantung Army's invasion of Manchuria lying down. In truth, it was more like gradually reclining. The Prime Minister learned about the troop movements from the newspapers. He didn't know what to tell the ambassadors when they called, and the Kwantung Army was not responding to his messages, telling them to stop and asking for updates.
So all I find myself thinking in all of this is how differently world history could have gone if this, what might have been a minor incident, and it could have been a minor incident. We look back at it now in history as saying this was a huge, huge deal. But how many times in history have things like this happened and they turned into nothing because of how they were dealt with up the chain of command, because people used their heads? And then, of course, other times, like we look at World War I and we look at an assassination and the diplomatic crisis that ensued afterward. Boy, how many other times in history might World War I or World War II type things been avoided if certain decisions had gone just a little bit differently? Man, there's such a what if here in all of this.
And who ordered this anyway? He definitely wasn't going to tell the foreign leaders he couldn't control his own military. He contacted one of the grand men of state, the last of the oligarchs, to try to get him to lobby someone, perhaps the emperor. No response.
Wow.
But this undeclared war was getting bigger. China had 200,000 troops in Manchuria, and the Kwantung Army was no match for that. So within days, generals ordered Japanese reinforcements in Korea to cross into Manchuria.
So now we're getting an escalation, and this is the kind of escalation that starts World War I, right? You know, the assassination was the assassination, but it was what really caused World War I was this build-up in tension and this build-up of militaries. You've got the arms race between the British and the Germans. You've got military mobilization that's taking place with Russia and with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and all of that ratchets things up to a point of no return. So right here, this could have been squashed by somebody saying, all right, we're pulling our troops out of Manchuria, or we're not sending additional troops, or making the right calls, maybe removing the military leaders that Japan's got in place in Manchuria. All of those things maybe could have avoided the situation, but instead weak leadership or an inability of those people to lead.
Soon the government assented to sending more troops from Japan itself. And there was another problem. The public loved it. War fever entered full swing. People started wearing kimono liners printed with tanks and fighter aircraft and flocked to cinemas to see newsreels of the combat. As far as the public was concerned, Japan was finally taking an active hand. After all, a lot of Japanese soldiers had died in World War I and the Russo-Japanese War to gain possessions in Manchuria, making it to them a graveyard of heroes. Further propaganda, much of it laid by the military, positioned Manchuria's natural resources as necessary to Japan's economy, though modern scholarship has suggested this was never the case. After all,
modern scholarship, honestly, though, is probably irrelevant on whether it's the case or not. It doesn't matter if it was actually the case. It only matters if people thought it was the case. If those people believed that those resources were necessary, it don't matter if it's true or not.
Who do you think was making all those newsreels everyone was watching? Yep, the army. Anyone who stood against the war was punished. Newspapers that criticized the Kwantung Army were subject to low sales or boycotts, politicians took note, and felt like they could do nothing. But it wasn't just public opinion they were afraid of. In October of 1931, less than a month into the war, young officers informed their superiors that members of the Cherry Blossom Society had concocted another plot to overthrow the government. They would take command of a group of aircraft and bomb the Prime Minister's cabinet meeting, decapitating the civilian government. Then, a troop uprising would capture government buildings, and they'd force the emperor, at gunpoint if necessary, to take power. Generals arrested the plotters and gave their ringleader the harsh punishment of 20 days house arrest. Yeah, many other officers got 10 days, while some were merely transferred. It was mostly kept quiet and treated.
And why can they do this? Because they know there's no consequences. There's nobody who's going to do anything about it.
Like an internal matter, which is not a big deterrent, right? Well, that was part of the problem. As we discussed last episode, there was a hesitation to punish these types of actions, partially because this was just a more extreme version of the nationalist message the government itself pushed, but also because these acts were seen as gaikokujo, a sort of patriotic insubordination. An idea that when things are wrong in Japan, idealistic men will sometimes do rash, rebellious, and self-sacrificial things to try to put things right. You know, like murder a politician or invade a country. And that while these actions were not exactly kosher, they still should be admired. Now at one time,
So in other words, the ends justify the means, or another way to look at it is if the motives are pure, the action can be forgiven, right? So, yeah, murder is normally frowned upon, but murder for the betterment of Japan, okay, we can look the other way.
Historians tried to explain this reactionary violence, and the public excusing it, entirely through the lens of Japanese culture. But there are other factors. For example, Japan's public education system, where most students dropped off after 6th grade, and even more after 8th. Only a few fully graduated, and even fewer went to college. Meaning in the troubled 1920s and 30s, most of the public lacked the tools to understand the complicated web of political, diplomatic, and economic forces now shaping their lives. And in the absence of that understanding, many people turned to conspiracy theories to explain their world, and supported extreme, often violent solutions to fix it. February 1932, Tokyo. This is their motto: one man, one kill. Lay preacher Nissho Inoue teaches an unusual creed. Combining Buddhist thought with Japanese nationalism, he urges the complete overthrow of the modern political and economic order. As a young man, he drifted until ending up in Manchuria, working on the railroad and as a paid informant for the military. There, he says he had mystical experiences, telling him that Japan must be renewed. He's drawn up a list of 20 names: liberal politicians, moderates, heads of corporations, and 20 volunteers, some civilian radicals, others naval officers, come forward to receive their assignments, along with the gift of a Browning automatic pistol.
This is fascinating because when you start introducing the mysticism or the religious aspect of it, people who buy into that, they're not going to question it, right? How can you question something that can't really be quantified? Well, just for example, God told me to do this. I mean, I'm not saying that's the case here, but I received a vision. You can't question that because you can't prove that I didn't. And so if people believe what you're saying or they believe in what you believe in, you can convince them to do pretty much anything.
They take a blood oath to fulfill their duty, which is why the press will come to call them the League of Blood. February 9th. a former finance minister and major player in the liberal Minzato party, steps out of his car to give a speech at a school. A League member guns him down. March 5th. The director general of Mitsui Bank is walking into the building when a League member draws a pistol and murders him.
Wow.
After their arrests, neither assassin is quiet about who directed them, and Nishio Inoue turns himself into a Tokyo police station 6
Martyr.
days later. But despite his imprisonment, naval officers associated with the group are planning something even bigger. May 15th. In his residence, Prime Minister Inokai Tsuyashi is worried. His predecessor had to resign over a failure to control the military, and though the emperor ordered him to restrain the militarists, nothing Inokai says seems to stop them. Plus, in January...
It's amazing how revered the emperor was, and yet how willing people were to just basically ignore what he thought or what he tried to do. Of course, I don't know how much that's the case. I don't know how much people were aware of the emperor trying to get involved. It's kind of interesting because my view had always been based on how things end up at the end of World War II and how the emperor was kind of seen as this kind of godlike figure and kind of off limits and all this sort of thing. And yet it seems like he really had very little influence in this situation.
The military had attacked Shanghai, China's largest city, over a deeply shoddy pretext. And when he tried to negotiate a solution with the Chinese, he'd gotten called a traitor for it. Now the Kwantung Army had declared a new Japanese puppet state in Manchuria, Manchukuo, and invited the deposed Chinese emperor to rule it. Inokai refused to recognize its legitimacy. Suddenly, outside the door, there's a scuffle. Shouts. 11 naval officers enter.
Wow.
They're young, no more than 20, and carrying pistols. If we could just talk, Inokai says, I could make you understand. The leader raises his gun. Dialogue is useless. They open fire. Like Inoue's League of Blood assassins, they're caught immediately. But that's the plan, because both groups will use their own trials as propaganda.
There you go. That was probably the thought process all along. Is what's the worst case scenario? They execute us, we're martyrs. And now we inspire 1,000 more people just like us. If they don't execute us, we get this incredible platform to get our views out there for the world to hear.
It's a media circus. When the judge tries to decide the case against Inoue and his two assassins based on facts, they whip up a publicity campaign, saying he's secretly a communist sympathizer with anti-Japanese views. Badgered in the press and mentally exhausted, the judge declares himself unfit and gives up the case. The new judge, a right-wing admirer of Inoue, lets him use the trial as a platform to spread his message to all of Japan. He allows Buddhist clergy allied with Inoue to testify that his actions with the League of Blood were spiritually pure and patriotic. At sentencing, the judge publicly states that he regrets having to give them life in prison and suggests the emperor might give them amnesty. The trial of Inukai's assassins is even more fevered. 110,000 people write or sign letters in their own blood saying the defendants should be released. 9 young men offer to die instead of the plotters and show their commitment by sending their severed little fingers to the court. The judge, intimidated by what happened at the League of Blood trial, lets the killers expound on their motives. Comments the newspapers then print and disseminate verbatim without comment. In military courts, the officers are charged not with murder, but rebellion. Defense attorneys argue that loyalty to the emperor is the basis of the law, and given their pure motives, to punish them harshly would...
In other words, and this happened a lot in England too, right? When people would rebel in medieval England, they would always make it very clear, we are not rebelling against the king, because the king was like seen as, he is England, right? So we're not rebelling against the king, so it's not treason. Because we recognize the sovereignty of the king. It's his advisors. It's those advisors that we're rebelling against. We've got to get rid of them. Kind of the same thing here. We are loyal servants of the emperor. It's the people running the country on behalf of the emperor that we needed to deal with.
Undermine the emperor and Japanese spirit. A Navy prosecutor isn't buying it. He goes after them hard, argues for the death penalty. After all, he says, motives shouldn't matter. Murder is murder. And if the court doesn't punish these men, it will only encourage more political violence. And he was right. Because the naval courts didn't listen, it gave the assassins only 15 years in prison. And the prosecutor, by contrast, was forced under public pressure to resign from the Navy. It was, as one British reporter said, a case of government by assassination. And it wasn't over. Not by a long shot.
This is intense stuff. I'm really glad I'm learning this, and I feel like I wish I had learned it a long time ago, because so much of this helps us understand what comes later, right? I mean, it gives us a much better window into the build-up, into what becomes World War II in the Pacific. Wow, this is fascinating stuff. I would love for you guys to continue the conversation, add to what we've talked about here, use the comment section below, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.